Welcome to Drinks in the Library, the only library where drinks aren't just allowed, they are required. I'm your librarian host, Gigi Howard, and each episode I'll be interviewing a guest about a much-loved book that we will be pairing with a drink for you to enjoy along with us or consider for your next book club meetup. As always, stay curious and support your local library. Hello, Liberation Nation. Are you ready to go back to the 90s? Well, today we're talking about one of the defining books of a generation, Generation X by Douglas Coupland. And I'm joined by David Howe. David is a father, husband, music lover, and proud Canadian. In this interview, David shared how this book shaped his life, his love of music, and also what it was like coming of age during that unforgettable era. Also, our drink this week, we are cracking open a classic Canadian drink. It's called a beer and clam. So I got Molson's Canadian beer, and it's a shot of Clamato juice. But David assured me that this is the ultimate Canadian drink. I also interacted with some of you on Threads who are familiar with the drink. And you let me know it could also be called a red eye or a Clameye. So learn something new every week. No matter what you call it, crack open a Molson's, pour a shot of Clamato in, and sip along with us. One last thing before we get started. If you're enjoying the show, please tell someone about it. Tell a friend. Also, go on Apple or Spotify or wherever you listen to your podcast and rate and review. That's how I hopefully will continue to grow. And with that being said, let's get started. Anyway, David, thank you so much. So what book are we doing?
We're doing Generation X by Douglas Coupland. He's a Canadian author.
Yes.
So were you familiar with the book at all?
No, I'll be very honest with you. I did not know that the name Generation X was based off a book. You introduced me to this.
Okay. Yeah, so he's a fairly young Canadian author when he wrote it. So he was, I believe, 30 or 31. Mm-hmm. And I read it at that time, so I read it as I guess this will date me, but I read this when I was in graduate school, and I was the target audience, I think. I was like early 20s, and read this book, and it was one of those ones where it's a book that's I think like a period novel, but the novel is based in the early 90s. Mm-hmm. I think it's very different to a lot of the stuff I was reading because it was still, I feel, literary and funny, but it wasn't written in a style that I was reading a lot. So there's a lot of great Canadian novelists that were writing books at that time, but this one was extremely, I think, had a different sound to it, and it really, it spoke to me as a young person reading the book.
Yeah. So where were you in graduate school? In Canada?
Yeah, I went to the University of Saskatchewan in Saskatoon, Saskatchewan. So I remember I was in graduate school there, and I remember taking this book out of the library, not out of the public library, but we had it in the university library. Because as you probably know, as a student, you never have any money. You know, you're in the library, you're reading books, and it came from the library. I read it, and it really spoke to me.
And then also your drink pick. What are we drinking?
So we're drinking, in Western Canada, you would just call this a beer and clam. So it's typically like a lighter beer, like a lager, and you would add a shot of Clamato. So it's very simple.
Yeah.
It would be something that you would go, so if you were in the bar and you were a 20-year-old, I think this is the other thing too. I remember being in a bar, you would go in and you would ask for a beer and clam, and you would get a pint glass of beer and I think like a shot. So normally you would have to take a couple of sips out of your beer and then you would just dump it in there. And I think it made it more nutritious. You know, I think it was for, at least for a university student, I think there was like some level of like vitamin.
Yeah, I'm getting
there.
Something today. And yeah. So you told me, so you texted me and you buried the lead because you were like, this is the most Canadian drink possible. And in my head, I was like, clearly Canadian?
That one too.
But then you're like, no, Clamato and Molson's. So this is also actual Molson's. I got it from Total Wine.
Wow. You went authentic for me. That was
I
really appreciate
nothing but the best. Nothing but the best Molson's.
Yes.
And so, it's very good. I'm
Yeah.
enjoying it. It's like a lighter Bloody Mary.
Yeah, that's what I did a little. I did a little deep dive too because I was thinking this has been a long time since I've had this particular drink. I don't think I've ever made it for, say, like a party or my wife or anything like that. I had to make sure that this was a real thing and it wasn't something that I was maybe misremembering or something that wasn't actually something that people do. But there's a huge Clamato Canadian. Like we drink a lot of Clamato apparently.
Yeah. No, I had a coworker who I was like, I gotta go find Clamato juice, and she was like, yeah, I was in Calgary, and she like pulled up a picture, and it looked, I think it probably had more Clamato in it. It looked like a Bloody Mary, basically.
Yeah, and then I think the Canadian version of the Bloody Mary, they use Clamato. It's called a Caesar. That's the drink. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and I also saw it called a Calgary Red Eye.
Oh, okay.
So you didn't make it up.
Okay.
It is authentically
thing.
Canadian.
Right. I feel good about that.
I think you should. Yeah. Awesome. All right. And so coming to the book, you're reading this, you're in graduate school. What's this story about? Because at first, I will also be honest, I thought it was like a nonfiction. I wasn't quite sure what to expect.
Yeah, it's funny because I when I was doing a little bit more research and I was looking at that book, because I also hadn't read the book in probably like maybe 30 years. So I had to rebuy the book because I believe my sister gave my copy away. So I'm not sure where the original one is, but this is not the original one. Mine, I think, was blue. I don't know. What color was yours?
So I got this one, and it's the same size.
Oh,
Mine's pink. Mine's got pink, and I guess it's set near Coachella, so it has the palm trees on it.
Yeah.
This is the 30th anniversary edition.
So when I was reading into it, it started as a nonfiction book. So it's interesting that you would say that that's how it reads. And I think he was commissioned to do a nonfiction book about the people after the baby boom. So all these young people that were coming out, they would have been born in the mid-'60s, early '60s, mid-'60s, and that was what it was supposed to be, was like a nonfiction commission book. And then this is what it turned into, and nobody wanted it. Or at least like the original people requesting the book did not want it. And then when they did get it published, I think it was published in the U.S., so I don't know if that changed in terms of setting or anything like that. But it's, when I read it, I never took it as nonfiction. I was just like, this is a story of three young people, and there's a Canadian in there. There is a friend that's Canadian, and then the other two are Americans. So they're all about the same age. They're living on their own, and they're displaced. So they've moved to the desert. So I think the setting is Palm Springs, and that's where the story starts.
Yeah. And were you connecting with them at the time? Who's your favorite? What drew you in about this story?
I think the narrator is Andy. I think when they talk, it's all in first person. So there's a lot of storytelling. So they tell a lot of stories to each other. They will oftentimes have their own sorts of chapters, so that when they are speaking, you're hearing from the other characters' voices. So the Andy character is the one that drives the story. So Andy's from Portland. His friend Dag is from Toronto. So there's always a Canadian theme in there. And I think what's really nice about this is that my son talks about like anything that is in the olden days. So my son will talk about like the olden days whenever he's talking to my younger son about anything that is a little bit like if we're watching a movie and it has, instead of animated characters, it has live action people. Yeah. He would call it like the olden days. So the olden days for him is always like the 90s.
Oh.
So it's one of those things where it's a period piece in a way where there's like these guys in the 90s, and he's totally right. Like the 90s were so technologically not advanced. It's a time before the internet and before cell phones. And it's really funny to think at the time it didn't feel like that. It felt like we were always on like the cusp of the next big thing. Yeah. But I think these characters are all sort of feeling the time that they're in is not a pleasant one. It's very desolate. Like the whole landscape is one where I think they are very uncomfortable about what the future lies.
Yeah, I think from what I understand, I did listen to a little bit of Coupland talking about it and preparing for this, and it's the baby boomers were so strong in controlling the culture, and like they would never let go, and so the generation that came up after that, the people that came up after that, they felt what's for us everything has already been established by this previous generation, and who are we and how do we define ourselves? And that was like this book was trying to do a little bit of that. And like you said, it's like desolation, feeling like what's next?
Yeah. And I think the other thing too, I think the one part about this book too, if you've even leafed through it, it's not a standard novel with it's short. There's a lot of margins. There's a lot of descriptions. It's almost it's almost like there's a built-in urban dictionary of slogans, and there's a lot of art in there. And the one thing I did notice when I was reading through again is that he tries to define a lot of things, and it's very, I think, tongue-in-cheek descriptions, but it's also very funny, just the descriptions that they're having. And some of the things that I don't think a lot of those had any widespread or mainstream use, but it was just things that you would think about as, I think, a young person in their 20s when you're starting out, finishing school, or maybe mid through school.
Yeah. It's also, I'm curious, thinking about how this term define the generation. How do you think people who are in Generation X feel about that? Or
yeah, so I think with the reading it in the early 90s, that wasn't a name that we were calling anybody. It was just something that came probably 10 or 15 years after that, or when they start to define like what each generation is going to be called. It's funny, like in the book, when you were saying they were describing like the boomers that were preceding Generation X, they're also not just described as boomers in the book. They're just yuppies. Yep. And it's really funny where I think Generation X is like that's a cool way to be just defined. And I'm actually more worried about like 10 or 15 years from now when the majority of the Generation X is in that in their 60s, and what will be called then. I think that's the scarier part.
Oh, I don't think it changes. I think you just keep whatever moniker they gave you, and y'all will stick with it.
But I feel like yuppies was so much better. I feel like boomers had such a negative.
Yeah, I didn't know that. My whole life it's been the baby boomers, my parents' generation, and so I never knew they weren't that. I thought they were always that.
Yeah, I think when they were in that generation where they're in their 40s and they have houses, they have cars, they have all those things, they were at least it was more positive to be a yuppie than being a boomer now, maybe.
Yeah, and it's coming right out of the 80s, too, which was the boomers were like in their 30s, and they were partying hard. So.
Yeah, and I think there was like I think there was a whole shift, too, in like the 80s where there was a lot of movies, like movies that would depict that wealth and that greed and all of that as being positive things, where I think with the Generation X that followed, it didn't seem like that was going to be there for us, and it was going to be, if not worse, different. It was going to be a different life that you were going to have. So I think that was the three friends are very in the same mindset that we don't have to. That's the other thing, too, is we don't have to. That doesn't have to be our life.
I wanted to bring up Reality Bites because I watched that probably within the last 10 years. And to me, watching that was like the young Generation X at the time. Absolutely. And that's so cool. And then who's the bad guy? He's not a bad guy. Ben Stiller. But he's the yuppie. Oh, yeah. And Winona Ryder and Ethan Hawke are the cool whatever.
Yeah, and I think that's such a great movie to also define that generation, and I think it parallels the book similarly in terms of just from the job choices. And I think the other thing, especially with Reality Bites, there are good jobs out there for people of that generation, and some of them choose that, and some of them choose to be outside of that. I was preparing. I read the book.
Good.
But I also just went into an early 90s, like a pre-internet, early 90s, like full immersion. So I watched Reality Bites.
Yay.
I watched Reality Bites again just to go back. All the music. Yeah, so Reality Bites was 94.
I think so, yeah.
Before that would have been Singles. Are you familiar?
I'm not.
So Singles is a Cameron Crowe movie.
Yeah.
And before that is 1989, which is like right before that was Say Anything. So it's like Say Anything, Singles, Reality Bites. So that would be like, if you really want to know what like early 90s, late 80s, early 90s culture is, that would be a trio. Okay. And then the book. and then you're set.
It brings us all together. And then so coming back to the book a little bit, so we've talked a little about Andy, but who are Dag and Claire?
So Dag is his friend, and they all meet. So they all meet in Palm Springs. So that's what brings them together. They're in a Melrose Place. They're not roommates, but they're in that same an apartment complex, but they're all
apartment
attached.
Dorm.
It's not. It's probably closer to dorm than apartment living. So they meet, and they're just essentially condo mates. Mm-hmm. Claire is from a wealthy family, and she's estranged from them, and she's from L.A. Dag is from Toronto, and he's, I think in every relationship you have token Canadian, but they blend so well. You can't, that's the thing about Canadians. They live amongst you, and, you wouldn't know. You
wouldn't know. We never know.
There's always some hints in there, and Andy has a lot of hints that he's actually not American either. You can blend so much until you show you're Canadian. But Dag, let's see. They all work sort of these, the other term that I guess is coined in here is the McJob. So they all have these jobs beneath their skill level or maybe their education, and they're bartenders in the desert, and that's how they meet and bond.
Yeah. What's the vibe of the story?
The vibe, let me see what I highlighted here. The tone of it, I think, it's something where I felt like when I was interested in reading but also writing, it seemed accessible. So it was one of those ones where it's written in a language where I can appreciate and read a lot of really good fiction, but I don't think that I could ever write like that. And I think when I was reading this one, it's written in a way where language is a little bit more conversational for, say, a 25-year-old. So it's got a very cool vibe. That's the whole vibe to it. It would be conversational, and when maybe it would be your smart friend that had big ideas. I think that's where you would, or if you had an older brother that was also the one that knew better music than you, or was helping you define who you are a little bit. Does that make sense?
That sounds very Gen X too. And Andy has a younger brother, because you bring that up too. Yeah. And he seems to almost treat the younger brother like how older generations treat the younger generations. It's you don't know anything.
And I think, too, when you go back, and I had to go through and figure out how old everybody is in the book. And so I think with this one, actually, Andy's actually not Gen X. He's actually a boomer, because he would have been if it's early 60s, he's right on maybe the tail end of the boomers.
Yeah. So how are we defining Gen X? What year?
Yeah, so I think that's the other thing, too, is on the book flap, it defines it in the 50s to 60s. And I think because it's before the internet, and actually before the terms are coined or the generations are defined, that's loose. I think in the book it's probably really late 50s, early 60s would be the start. And then the tail end of Generation X isn't even really old enough to, if it's the ending in the 80s, they're only 11 years old by the time the book's written. But you're not really considering that age group in the book. I think it's really the ones that they're talking about at the early 60s to 70s.
Yeah. I also, something that he said when I was listening to him is, and I wish I could remember the other bands, but he was basically, you're Gen X if you like Talking Heads, and then he named two other bands, and he's like, if you didn't listen to those growing up, then you're not Gen X.
Yeah, and I think that's perfect too, because all the music is so defined by that generation as well, and I think it's the ones, Talking Heads would be a great one, but any of them from that early 90s, all those bands that came out of Seattle, so that whole grunge movement in the early to mid 90s, those were the huge next bands. And I think that's that other thing too, is that once you start to see your generation making the popular media, whatever it is, so whether it's books or music or movies, those are the things that are going to really define which way that generation is going. Because when I was looking back at that early 90s thing, it could have gone many ways. At the beginning of the 90s, you're moving out of the late 80s where there's a lot of big hair rock. And another decade of that would have been
too much.
It'd be you're right. That's too long for big hair arena rock. And so going into more of a noisier, independent, alternative sound was really refreshing, I think, in the early 90s. And I think, maybe this, Andy's not recognizing that maybe that's a good thing, where his younger brother, Tyler, is, I'm not sure the ages, but probably a few years younger. And he's like the true Gen X person, but he doesn't feel as morose or as downtrodden as the rest of like his friends. Like he seems very upbeat and very excited about like his prospects. Like he's very excited about the future, where the other three are they're hedging a little bit.
Yeah. And at the time, nobody knew that the internet was coming.
Yeah.
It was like, this is the way it's going to be, and we know everything. How do you reflect on that experience?
I think it goes back to like what my son was saying about like the old, where like when they talk about their parents in here being very afraid of technology, but they're talking about the modern technology in like 1991. But the modern technology in 1991 is like they refer to VCRs being a big thing, the microwave, and the answering machine. That was like the big technology. And then it was funny, like watching those movies, like every one of those movies has some sort of answering machine, like as a big plot.
Oh, it was a huge thing. You would come home, if we have any Gen Zers here, you would come home, check your answering machine, see if any of your friends call.
Yeah, and I think like when you're, before forecasting any technology, like future technology, like it was really, if that's the technology we had in the 90s, it was really more like the 60s than it was like 1995. Like once 1995 to the 2000s, like it's a completely different world. And it was in a lot of ways so much simpler. So that was the other thing too. If you watch those movies from the 90s, they go to parties. There's no time wasted on any sort of device of anything. You have to read a book. There was board games being played. It's a much simpler life. It was very, very much the olden days.
Yeah. And I was also curious, like going back until the music changed, my impression of the 90s, and I was in the 90s, but I was a kid, little kid, and then later a teenager. But for those early years, like I know Nirvana, I don't know Talking Heads, but the impression that I get from like the culture was this very not wanting to be a sellout. I think that's the general vibe I got from Generation X.
Yeah, that was you didn't want to look like you were trying too hard.
Yeah.
There was still like a lot of trying beneath that, but it was still like, you didn't want to be any type of a poser of any sort, or to seek the attention. You would always like, if the attention or the popularity that you got was just, it wasn't intentioned. It was just something that you took along with the territory. That was the baggage that you had if you were, I guess, popular at that time.
What were you and your friends doing at this time?
When you're watching all these house parties, and that was like, that whole thing that was the internet. You had to go out, you had to be seen. That was your social media. It was just going to bands, going to parties, and that's how people socialized. So I think that's why, my love of music has gone through all those decades, is that's just what I know. Go to a show, listen to a band, buy CDs. These are things that I still do now.
What are your favorite bands?
So from that era, so like early 90s, anything, the Pixies. So Pixies, Nirvana, Alexis and I we're at the Weezer.
Oh, yeah.
So that's early 94. It's the 30th anniversary of 1994. So they were back on tour, touring that album. That was really fun. Yeah, a lot of those early alternative 90s bands.
So what are some of the excerpts that you want to talk about
from
the
Can
book?
I look?
Yeah.
Yeah, so I think the one thing, I think that especially at the very beginning, when you're looking through the book, there's a lot of stuff. I guess in the margins, they just have, it's like a glossary of such.
Yeah.
The one thing I know that, I don't think they use it anymore, but the McJob was something that he describes as a low pay, low prestige, low dignity, low benefit, no future job in the service sector, frequently considered a satisfying career choice by people who have never held one. So it's a lot of people's first jobs, or in this case, it's not. These are professionals that are coming back to a job that's out of their skill set, so something that they don't need necessarily any education for, but just in this case, I think bartending. Claire works in a retail department store, so just these jobs that you will still do, because I think that's the other positive thing about Gen X, is that we're hardworking. They're hardworking. They don't want anything necessarily for free. They don't want anything they still want to work, but they don't necessarily need to achieve like their parents do. So I think that's one of the things that's, I think, central to the book is, like you were saying, like that whole, your picture of the 90s, I think is, like you don't have to try so hard. You don't have to necessarily be like your parents or defined in that way.
So the Mick job, that wasn't just getting a job at McDonald's. That was working like retail or working in a restaurant, things like that.
Yeah, I think wait staff, valet, I think all of those would be jobs that I think also probably one where you still have to be an adult, but it's like one of these ones where it's somehow beneath your skill set. I think the other ones that are coming into, so Andy is coming from a job where he was like in graphics. Now I'm confusing him with the actual Douglas Coupland. Coupland is also essentially the Andy character. Yeah. They have very similar origin stories, the two of them.
Yeah. It seems like Douglas Coupland, I think he said he wishes he'd never left art school. He wishes he was always in art school. And I get the vibe that they all feel like they're artists and that to do anything else is to take away from their integrity or something.
I think so. Like the one thing I read about him when he landed the nonfiction assignment that turned into this book was that he was traveling and he was writing postcards. So he had written some postcards back to Canada, I guess, and an editor for the publication wanted him to write for the magazine. So that was like part of it was just like you get essentially dream job by not trying very hard. You're corresponding to a friend or whatever, and that turns into your entire career. And I think that's another aspect of it too that I loved thinking about, that he doesn't feel like he's like working. Like this is something that is beyond job where you're a graphic artist or whatever his background was. Like it just seems like he fell into this in the best Gen X way possible, just like you fall into something like that.
Good for him. He also was talking about Americans and how anything that we do becomes a product. And he was like, I'm sorry if I have any Americans listening. And I'm like, it's quite all right. I hear what you're saying. I don't know if that's always the impression. You've been here for a while.
Yeah, let's see. I was doing the math there. Yeah, I think in the next year or two, I'll probably have spent as much time in the U.S. as I have in Canada. So yeah, I'm blending.
One day at a time.
Yeah, just it comes out like every once in a while, like if you ever want to figure out if there's a Canadian amongst you, you can ask them to say certain words because there's certain words that Canadians will pronounce and you have to correct yourself to be more American. But mine is always process. Like I'll always say process instead of process. Yeah, process is like a really big.
But yeah, it's just a little hint of it. And then when you're at the bar and they're like, I'll have a Calgary red eye, please. Then you know.
That one's a big one.
So just coming back to the book, is there anything else that we haven't hit on with the story you wanted to discuss?
Oh, I guess, the one thing that's in there too, there's a lot of there's the Urban Dictionary that you read through. It's never actually used in the text, though, so it's not like he would put the definition of something and he's using it in context in the book in any way. It's just more, it's like extra, like it's just this extra piece. The other part in there's a lot of slogans, which would probably be good, like on T-shirts. And then there's a lot of artwork that's just very much like those Roy Lichtenstein, that style of art. So it's really... I'm not sure actually if he did any of that. I didn't do any research to see if that was his artwork. But it was. I think when you're used to the internet and you're reading any sort of media, to catch your eye, there's got to be a lot of stuff that is beyond just the text. So I think in a lot of ways, this was the internet. This was like it was all in here. There was stuff to distract you from the rest of the text. And I think it's really, I don't know of another book like that.
It's definitely an interesting style. It's like right here, yuppie wannabes, an X-generation subgroup that believes the myth of a yuppie lifestyle being both satisfying and viable, tend to be highly in debt, involved in some form of substance abuse, and show a willingness to talk about Armageddon after 3 drinks.
I guess that's another big theme in that whole book. I think that's the other thing, too, about the 90s. Just about the time that we're living in is so uninteresting. Like nothing is happening. There's no war, which actually is good, but there's no war. There's no adverse sort of thing that you're battling.
Yeah.
And the underlying doom is always like this nuclear kind of a Holocaust type thing.
Yes.
Like that's like the thing that is on, maybe not on your mind, but the thing that you're dreading most? If you were to go back in time and tell these people, like, it's all actually going to be pretty good. It's all going to be good. You're like, wait till 1995 when there's going to be some bands that you're going to be like, but there's also going to be the internet, email, all of these cell phones. Just, you don't even know what's going to happen in the next few years. Just hold steady, guys. You're going to be okay. It seems like very doom and gloom, but there's not going to be a nuclear war. There's not going to be a ton of hardship for you, and it's actually going to be pretty good. It's going to be a nice. If you can wait it out and pivot from your job, I think it's going to be okay. It's going to turn out for you.
Good. And so going back to how it's like defining talking heads as, if you like, this is Gen X, and you were talking about like nuclear war and the Cold War and everything. I think like the next generation, which I'm technically in the millennials, I'm an older millennial. Like the Cold War technically was still going on when I was a little kid. But by the time I was a kid, it was over. The Berlin Wall was down. And so I think when we start, everyone wants to put years on things, but I think it's like thinking about the things that define that time period, and your experience of it is really what defines generations.
Yeah. I like that. Like when I was going through, because there's a lot of clues in there. One excerpt in there where essentially states that it's like 1991, or you can do the math and it's like 1991. But there's a lot of clues in there because they're still talking about the USSR, so there's still the dissolution of the Soviet Union has not happened yet. It's like there's a lot of positive things that are coming, but I think at this particular time, it is maybe a boring, not a lot going on.
We grew up, we were on the edge of disaster, and now nothing?
Yeah, it's one where the parents are all accumulating wealth, and you're dirt poor, and you feel like there's no prospects. But I don't think that's actually any different than any other generation when you're young.
I think we all experience it differently, and probably some better or worse, depending on different scenarios. But being in your early 20s, being a young person is a struggle. And I think that's why they put in, like, when you take surveys, are you 18 to 25? You feel this type of way. Are you 25 to 30? And then I started noticing now I'm in the 35 to 44 bump. And so what happens at 44?
Yeah, I remember that time because I'll talk about my sister again. But I remember when, I think it's actually J. Crew. Like J. Crew had like the cutoff, like in that 35 to 49. And then once you hit this other one, you're 50 to like 70.
No. She was probably very offended. 49 to 70. Hold on. It's a big span. Yeah. So I wanted to ask, have you read The 90s by Chuck Klosterman? Because if not, I think you would like it.
Yeah.
That one's a good one.
I've read something by
Chuck Klosterman.
Yeah. Is that
Sex, Drugs, and Cocoa Puffs, I think he wrote.
I have that. I've got to do a little bit. I'm still totally fine staying in this immersion into the early 90s because I haven't really left all that. I haven't fully departed from the early 90s. When you think of a generation that, or a timeline that defines you, I think, for me, 90, 94, I haven't really strayed much from that, that timeline. So I'm not sure if that's the same for everybody or if that's...
And you're making me think about the fact that, like, when I am at the gym, my playlist is maybe 98 from when I was 16, 17, 15. Anyway, 98 to, like, 2005. Like, I think it's just you're in the time period where the culture is just made for you. All the songs are written by people the same age as you. The clothes are made for you. And so it's hard. So, I try to listen to, like, modern pop or, like, modern hip-hop, and I'm just like,
I think you just got to find something that is similar. That's what I do now, is just to try to find something that sounds like that. And because I think there's that, the one thing that doesn't change is that people are always still making the same music that you like or liked. It's just that you have to, maybe it's a little harder to find it now because you're not in the bar or you're not, like, that's the one thing that is different, is that you've changed.
Yeah, that's true. What's some good modern recommendations for 90s music lovers?
Oh, jeez.
I don't want to put you on the spot. If I am, don't worry about it.
We go to a lot of bands now. A lot of the times it's like everybody, those guys from the 90s, they're still touring.
Yeah, Pearl Jam's still touring. Right?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah. And every year I do a playlist for the year. So I I feel like 30 years is a really good time to have enough time to reflect about the year. At the beginning of January, I always make a playlist from 30 years ago. So like I did the 94 playlist earlier this year, and that one was so easy because there's just so much in 94. All those albums are having their 30th anniversary.
Yeah.
So Green Day, Weezer, they all have these really pivotal albums in their collection from 94.
Right,
so
right.
There's a few. I did a whole Generation X playlist for you too, but I could think of a few.
Okay.
Do you want me to list them?
Yeah, it might be interesting for somebody
Maybe.
who's, I want to read this book and I want to go listen to some good songs to go with it.
So Canadian band, it's late 20, what do you call music from like the 2019 or 20?
Oh, the aughts. No, not the aughts. The tens, yeah.
Yeah, so those, like Canadian band is Always with 2 V's. Always is a good Canadian band from like the late 2010s. There's a guy that he had a new album that just released 2 weeks ago. It's his 5th album. He's 25. He's from North Carolina.
Oh!
Yeah. MJ Lenderman.
MJ Lenderman, okay.
Yeah, so that would be a really good one. Yeah, listen to that one.
Okay.
The new album, it's from 2 weeks ago, but it could be from 1996.
Okay.
I think.
Read this book, pour yourself a red eye.
Beer and clam.
Beer and clam.
If you want spicy, apparently.
Take a shot with it if you feel like. Who knows?
Kroger has spicy.
Yeah,
Clamato.
Kroger has a spicy option. Yeah, so good. So my last question always is, who would you recommend this story
Oh,
for?
I think anybody that's interested in the olden times. Yeah, so if you're interested in what the world was like, how many years ago is that now?
35-ish,
Yeah.
33-ish.
And it's a very definitive time, pre-internet and pre-GPS, or you had to do a lot of work on your own.
Yeah, know the names of streets.
Social media, if you want to socialize in a different way, you could try early 90s socialization. So yeah, like new people, I think people our age probably lived through it, so maybe they would find it a little cringe. I don't know if that's what...
That is...
I don't know if it would be, but I felt it held up better than I thought it would.
Yeah.
Like it was one of those ones where, in anything that you look back 30 years from now, this one has stood the test of 35 years.
Yeah.
Time being a fairly short period there. But
It isn't that long in the grand scheme of things, but now the culture moves so quickly. So anyway, thank you so much for doing this.
This was so fun.
I'm glad you thought it was fun, not too much homework. You stay immersed into the 90s culture.
I will.
All right, there we go. Thank you for spending some time with me and my guest for an episode of Drinks in the Library. For more information about the show, you can find us on Instagram at Drinks in the Library, on the World Wide Web, drinksinthelibrary.com, or shoot me an email at drinkspod@gmail.com. Until next time, cheers.